In their most common mass-market guise, video games tend to focus on the taboo and the prohibited, the illegal and the unfashionable. At risk of sounding reductive, any handful of high-profile video game releases will be power fantasies that act out in some way a break from the norm. They'll focus on shooting things, or breaking the speed limit, making a mess, making a scene. Within any handful of popular video games, there'll be a wealth of variation mechanically, from devious puzzles to balls-to-the-wall action, but thematically, video games consistently find themselves drawn towards that one experience, the power fantasy. I think this is why the Hitman series of video games has always blended in so nicely with the mainstream. Hitman games thrive on power fantasies. The scale dioramas they present are engines with which anyone can violently break away from the norm. Hitmen and assassins are some of the most effective agents when it comes to power play. Thematically, they tend to find themselves positioned in the darkened underside of everyday life, playing right into the voyeuristic impulses that compel us to toy with the taboo and the prohibited. All the while, in terms of gameplay mechanics, they frequently find themselves in positions of initiative in which there's no greater display of power than making the first move. The Hitman games monopolise on video gaming's proclivities towards mischief and violence, and do so with a wit and irony that manages to remove any question of bad taste. Hitman 2016, Square Enix's recent soft reboot of the series, continues this tradition admirably.
Like you see a ghost, huh? Hey, I found someone. Calling command. Here's copy. We got trouble. Behind.
Target down. Next up, Silvio Caruso.
I would strongly advise you to leave the area. Huh?
The clearest strength of the Hitman games is that they've always been good at creating a sense of place. After all, when it comes to causing mischief, it's difficult to transgress from the norm if you can't pin down what the norm actually is. As far as I'm concerned, this is where many stealth games fall down. They portray areas in flux with no clear status quo. In a game like Dishonoured, for example, there's a considerable suspension of disbelief required, wherein the player has to repeatedly tell themselves that the world could still exist if they weren't there, that its violence could sustain itself, that even if you weren't there, guards would always be patrolling the sewers of Dunwall in such force. In a large majority of stealth games, you have to actively convince yourself that this is a real world that you've fallen into, one in which other people can live and operate, as opposed to a series of events designed with the sole purpose of entertaining you and you alone. Hitman is different. In Hitman, it's easy to get the sense that life goes on without you. All good Hitman levels start with an established degree of normalcy. They are clearly defined places in time, loaded with unassuming characters simply getting on with life, running errands or meeting with friends. There's a clear system of order in place, and the joy of playing the game comes from subverting that system of order, and transgressing against the normalcy of your environment. The power play in any given Hitman level derives from its openness. The player is placed in a closed system, for example a Russian oligarch's party or a gated suburban community, and is told to take out a target within. The key draw is usually the player's ability to immerse themselves in this system. Although crawling through the shadows, as in any other stealth game, is a viable option, in Hitman the player can also adopt a more social form of stealth, donning the clothes of other characters and playing their part to blend in. If most stealth games get their thrills from the outside looking in, then Hitman instead looks from the inside out, allowing its player to immerse themselves in the lives of others, guide them, and in many cases become them. Hitman 2016 leans into the power fantasy of its disguise system more so than any of its predecessors, and complements it with a level of detail in its world that begs you to explore. Although the crux of its gameplay still ultimately revolves around assassination, the biggest hint is the name after all, it doubles up nicely as a people-watching simulator. Levels are large and dense and full of ancillary characters with their own stories to tell, and there are enough widgets and big red buttons scattered around to influence these characters to move from one place to another and see how they react. Donning the clothes of this escort, for example, allows you to guide this target to a destination of your choosing, on a path of your choosing. Alternatively, detonating an explosive nearby is a more direct way to get him to run where you need him. Or you can simply leave a breadcrumb trail of shiny objects to lead him along shorter distances. You can use these opportunities for voyeuristic effect too. A target in the process of evacuating an area will react differently to one quietly meandering through their daily routine, and the process of seeing a target go through the motions as the level status quo gets thrown increasingly into chaos, oftentimes while you're disguised as their best friend, is the sort of fantasy that Hitman creates so well. The Hitman series occupies a unique space in the stealth genre. Because the player can immerse themselves in their environment, the core gameplay loop doesn't revolve around staying unseen so much as staying unnoticed. It's a subtle distinction, but one that gives the player more breathing space, placing less emphasis on the physical presence of their character and instead shining a spotlight on the player's target. Any playthrough of a Hitman level is constrained to just one approach, so by nature, on your way to your goal, you'll inevitably see 10 other ways you could have reached your goal instead, and this lends each level to multiple playthroughs, in each of which you're likely to observe something new about the characters within, and how you can interact with them.
Jesus! We need to find the cause. Check everything.
Hitman 2016 is one of the most interesting simulation games out there, and I think this is why it's such a shame that the game's surrounding interface is so obstructive. The scoring system, in particular, leaves a lot to be desired, insofar as it tends to reward the mundane. To score well and obtain the game's 5-star rating, you can't blow your cover, you can't allow bodies to be found, and you're encouraged to complete the mission as quickly as possible. The scoring screen is the centerpiece at the end of every mission, and in this regard, I think it's given undue importance. To satisfy it, you either have to cut yourself off from a large portion of the game's opportunities, or you have to game the system. You have to push against the edges of the game's carefully cultivated sense of verisimilitude, and seek out increasingly implausible methods of assassination. Some players use these limitations to achieve great things. Most players, however, will likely fall back on inane AI tricks and a limited number of prescribed routes through each level in order to have something worth looking at once the level is over and done with. Of course, you don't have to adhere to the game scoring. As long as you get in, kill your target and get back out, your mission is considered a success, at least as far as the game's story progression is concerned. But the scoring system does highlight a larger prescriptive design tendency in Hitman 2016, one that subtly detracts from its initial anything goes posturing. For example, unlocking new weapons and equipment is contingent on meeting the game's prescribed challenges, and while that gives the game a sense of persistent progression, it inversely gives any run that deviates from the game's scripted avenues a sense of futility. It doesn't help that the bulk of the game's unlockables, loud, unconcealable weapons, very rarely tie in with the game's challenges or scoring. This is a game brimming with options, but in which some options are unwittingly given more value than others, and it's in the moments where the player is made aware of this. For example, when they pull off a conceptually satisfying hit only to be told that it was objectively bad in the game's eyes, that the cracks in the system begin to show. Compare this with 2006's Hitman Blood Money, in which success is measured via an indiscriminate text rating, and bizarre assassinations are rewarded by dynamically generated newspaper articles. These take the place of a scoring screen, and acknowledge the player's actions in a more meaningful way. In Blood Money, the cold, hard experience points of Hitman 2016 are traded out for unjudgmental dollar amounts, and regardless of performance, dollars are plentiful. With them, the player is afforded the choice to unlock what they want, so that the game shapes itself around their preferred playstyle piece by piece. Hitman 2016 lacks this nuance, and it can occasionally feel obstructive as a result. Obstructive is, unfortunately, a word that arises frequently when considering Hitman 2016's ancillary design. If the game's core is a masterclass in interactive power fantasies, the surrounding structure is a workshop in frustration. A lot of this owes to the game's framing as an online experience, and as a result its susceptibility to sudden wind changes in the developers' offices, not to mention in the player's internet connection. Game mechanics change periodically, temporarily spoiling the game's oft-mentioned Groundhog Day sense of predictability, while people playing offline are effectively barred from the game's more entertaining toys. All the while, static menus chug along while they wait for images to stream from distant servers, and the game's alternative game modes, the ones that are being used to justify the online component in the first place, feel like second-rate missions at best and busy work at worst. Most of these secondary modes are designed to make you think. Beneath the fantasy of Hitman, there's a puzzle-like element to working out targets' routes, and yet in a lot of the game's side challenges, the act of completing a mission tediously extends on long after the puzzle has been solved. If I'm going to sit here and list flaws, the list could go on and on. For example, longtime series composer Jesper Kyd is no longer on board, and in his wake the new soundtrack has taken on a spy film theming that occasionally feels more like parody than homage. I've always felt like Jesper's soundtracks succeeded because they reflected their surroundings more than their protagonist. In 2004's Hitman Contracts, for example, this song, which plays over the darkened streets of Hong Kong, incorporates the noise of the street itself, and also uses esoteric local instrumentation to express something foreign, and by extension, the player's role as an outsider. Compare it with this track, which plays in both Bangkok and Paris in Hitman 2016. This new soundtrack feels less layered. It draws less from its surroundings and more from a fringe interpretation of the game's protagonist, and it feels shallow as a result. As I said, I could list flaws all day, but I think that's only because I've been thinking about Hitman 2016 a lot since I first played it in March. It's easy to criticise, but that's only because at heart, it's one of the most engaging games released this year. Levels are expansive and painstakingly detailed, and playing Voyeur is rewarded more than in any Hitman game to date. It's an engine for discovery and mischief that never ceases to surprise. Look past the frills, and that all-important power fantasy is louder and larger than ever.
Good thinking, 47. DeSantis will arrive shortly. This is one time the dame won't fool the detective.
Under arrest. Put those hands up. No sudden moves.